Casey Stoney had some words where she held the players to task and she held them to account and said, if you're not performing in club, you will not come into camp. I think that she needs to stick to that threat or to those words.
Welcome back to Match Day Live. And you know, people often get reflective at this time of year, looking back on the year that was. And that's a fun exercise if the year's gone well. Slightly more challenging if it hasn't. And I say that as we look at Canada's results over the course of 2025. Tonight's loss is the team's 6th defeat this year, the most in a calendar year for the program since 2013. So all that to say, Jess, how would you rate this year for this team?
Yeah, I think we keep hearing this, it's a transitional year, and I think they started off quite strong with that Pinatar Cup win. Obviously, the opponents weren't as strong as what we're seeing them play against now, but I think it was a disappointing year. They haven't really made many strides as far as that role clarity amongst the players, staying cohesive defensively, finding that edge offensively. They're lacking in a lot of part of their games, and the defensive aspect of it is really disappointing because we know how Canada plays. It's a part of their identity. Everyone knows that the Canadians are that gritty team that love to get stuck in, and even if they don't get the result, you can't walk away saying the Canadians didn't want it. And I think that's the most disappointing part about 2025 for the Canadians. But I also think offensively, we saw that there's a lack of, potentially it's a personnel thing. I mean, I'm not too sure, but nobody has been performing as they should be in that final third to find the back of the net.
Yeah, I think it's a case of personal standards, professional standards for the individuals not being high enough, not being executed on the pitch. They're not expressing themselves the way that we know that they can. And then collectively, there's just been a disconnect. And much the way that matches can be tales of two halves, I think this year under Casey Stoney, after, we're coming to a close, is going to be 12 months once 2026 starts. It was very much front-loaded with lots of positivity. I think there were ups and downs, but they were low ebbs and, a little bit higher flows, and then steady hand, and this team was growing into something. But they were shell-shocked and absolutely outclassed and played off the pitch when they lost 3-0 to the U.S. at the beginning of July, and they did not recover from there. So this is this team now, I think, emerging on the other side where there's a little bit more of a positive performance. They looked more like themselves, tenets of play that we expected to see. Maybe an identity is slowly emerging, but I think that this is this team still recovering. You look back at a year ago, they tied Spain 1-1. They ended the year beating South Korea 5-1. They looked like they were really on a high coming off of something, but they dealt with something that was intensely traumatic with the Paris 2024 Olympics. And then you felt like, okay, they've recovered. They're under Casey Stoney. That trust is being rebuilt, but I don't think they ever fully recovered. So that has to be kind of uncovered, dealt with, move on, and then layer on this philosophy, layer on the confidence. And this team needs to get on the ascent, and they need to do it quick because next year in November is World Cup qualifying, and they need to come out swinging or else they're going to be left behind.
Jess, you mentioned the Pinatar Cup early, but certainly this year has ended on a sour note for this team as we look at their recent struggles here. Look at all those zeros. No goals in the last 5 games, no wins in the last 5 games either. And this coaching staff has repeatedly said they value playing against top opponents because it's a measuring stick. But the problem is they've really struggled against these top 20 teams. Amy, where do they go from here, and what needs to change so that this team can turn things around in 2026?
Well, I think if you go back to that defeat versus the U.S. and the way that this team has performed poorly, Casey Stoney had some words where she held the players to task and she held them to account and said, if you're not performing in club, you will not come into camp. I think that she needs to stick to that threat or to those words. And I don't mean to say that the players should be belittled or disparaged after a poor loss. That's not what I'm saying. But if she is saying that she needs the standard to be better in camp and players have to perform, then only bring in the players who are truly in form and then reward them like tonight where an Evelyn Vienne gets a run of minutes to actually show what she can do. And she's a hair offside and has potential to change the game there with Janine Sonis, who was also tremendous tonight with her service, playing a deeper lying position. You can reward players who have been veterans, who have been mainstays of this program, but others need to be left out in order to shake this up And new players need to get blooded. We need to see new faces in this program to build that competition in these different roles under Casey Stoney.
Without a doubt. And I think, it's the greatest honor to be able to represent your country. So if you're holding that standard, those players that are in the mix, as Amy called them, veteran players, if you're not performing at that level, then maybe you're not supposed to be called into that next camp. Go back to club, perform there, and earn that call-up. I think that there's an aspect of complacency sometimes that creeps in with this squad. For the longest time, we knew exactly who was making that final roster. There was maybe 1-2 names brought into camp, but they were left off the final roster. So that's frustrating as a Canadian where, you know there are players out there. You know that there's talent in Canada. So absolutely, I think it's about sticking to that standard, as Amy said, and just holding that every single time they're making that final roster, they're inviting players in, making sure that the players that are on that list deserve to be there based on what they're doing.
Well, you guys are both bringing up personnel, and Casey Stoney has too, but she's lamented what she calls a lack of depth in this player pool in this country. What do you make of that, Jess?
Yeah, I think that maybe you got to look a little harder. Like, as somebody who has come through the program and seeing so many talented faces get left off of rosters or potentially stepped away from the game because that pathway to the national team just was not there. Former staff has had blinders on, for lack of a better word. They really you knew exactly who was making that squad, and it didn't matter how they were performing, they were getting that call up, whereas there was players who were maybe performing and they weren't getting that reward. And that's frustrating as a player. And I think that there are so many talented players. We're seeing it in the NSL, for example, young players. Holly Ward is a perfect example of this. That's somebody that is performing in club, gets the call up, and does well for country. And that confidence just continues to grow. We spoke about DB Pridham. That's somebody that's new to this. And I just think that there's so many talented players in this country. And if you look a little harder, I guarantee you there's a lot of talent that maybe was never in the program. Maybe they're not a known name, but they're hiding somewhere.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. And I also think with the emergence of the Northern Super League, the better than expected quality on the pitch with that standard of play, it's going to take a couple of years until the NSL and perhaps academy programs in the pathway underneath that, being the peak of the pyramid, is going to produce players of national team quality that are starting and regularly getting called into the roster. But I think that you can expand that kind of provisional roster so that more players are on the radar, because I don't think that gap between our top tier program and our top tier players and the tier 2 players is that great. And I think what a league like the Northern Super League is going to do is continue to widen that roster, deepen it, so that we have more players who are known and more players who are pushing, and so that in-house competition allows the collective level to continue to be raised. And we're going to see more players like Holly Ward, more players like Kaylee Hunter, more players like a DB Pridham who are known dual citizens that might show allegiance to Canada and they can get blooded. But what's cool about this is that you're going to see players fast-tracked at 16, 17, 18 years old that haven't been through NDCs, that haven't been through youth national teams, that are coming through a more varied pathway, and then all of a sudden with that net cast wide, then what you get at the top is a really deep pool of extremely talented players who can compete for Canada.
Well, you mentioned players like Kaylee Hunter, like DB Pridham. Take a look at this board and their goal contributions in the NSL. 16 goals for Kaylee Hunter, 20 for DB Pridham. So, Amy, this speaks to exactly what you're saying. And Amy, one other thing I wanted to pose to you is this idea of a team in transition. So many people are describing this team as such, but how long do you give a team in transition before you need to start seeing results?
Well, I think when you look at this, take a step back, you look at the balance of the year and the performances. We know, like, the back half of the year was disappointing. Yes, it was against top tier opponents, but it's the perfect time to have that type of experience, because this year didn't have any, I hesitate to use the word meaningful competition, but you didn't have a competition on the docket other than the Pinatar Cup at the beginning of the year against teams like China, like Mexico, like Chinese Taipei, and you rolled. Predictably, you're expected to win, and you did, and that's a feather in your cap. But now that you're struggling, now that you're put to the test here, Casey Stoney is also under the gun to figure out how does she lead this team into a successful 2026 when you know that World Cup qualification is coming in November, and the competition in CONCACAF in the region is getting a little bit more robust. But really, this is the time, if we have a silver lining to all of this, even though it's difficult, it's challenging, they have been unrecognizable in the way of performances and also in results, Jess. But this is the year to really have that type of uneven year.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, Casey Stoney has said it multiple times, like she doesn't mind getting things wrong right now to get them right later. But I do think, the transitional phase, I mentioned it a little earlier, it's one thing to go through that transitional phase. It's a given. You have a new coaching staff. You're going to have new tactics. We're seeing new combinations of players. So there is some leeway there. I think that the frustrating part as a fan and as someone watching the game is when the basic things are not being taken care of. When, as we spoke about, effort or grit or little things like that, or just picking up the open man in the box. It didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It happens multiple times. So little things like that where you can't blame them on the transitional phase. Sometimes I feel that it's a bit of a cop-out at times. But I do agree that there is some leeway. Of course, there's going to be that transitional phase. This is the time to do it. Next year is when you really got to turn everything on and figure it out, lay out that foundation. I think that's what they're trying to do this year, figure out what works for them, figure out what doesn't work for them. So absolutely, I think they've shown some growth in certain areas. I think they've struggled and they have a lot more growth to show in a lot of other areas. But overall, as Amy said, there's a silver lining to everything. So I think sometimes you do have to get it wrong to learn from it.
Well, listen, Casey Stoney always said this would be the year of experimentation. So presumably in the new year, we'll find out what the results of this experiment have been. Will, as Amy said, there'll be new faces in the mix? Will we say goodbye to some veterans? Will there be positional changes, culture changes? So much will be revealed in the year to come. The only prediction that feels safe for me to make right now is that 2026 will not be boring as far as this team is concerned. And if you want to stay up to date on everything that goes down with this team, you're in the right place because we have got you covered. On behalf of Jess Lisi, Amy Walsh, Adam Jenkins, and the entire crew, I'm Kate McKenna. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the new year.